We good? All right. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the last of our BESE Accountability Work Group meetings. Thanks for those in attendance this morning, and for those looking online. Thanks to our panel that's been through this process with us through each and every meeting. And then we have an in-person guest this morning. Chris Domaleski is here with us in Baton Rouge this morning. So welcome, Chris.
Thank you.
So I'd like to get us started out. Looks like we need a roll call. So could we get some help with the roll call, please?
Dr. Bofi? Here. Mr. Castillo? Here. Dr. Davis?
Here.
Ms. Holloway?
Here.
Mr. Morris?
Here.
You have a quorum.
Thank you. So I'd like to start out with recognition of guests. So for those who may not be familiar with our panel, I'd like to have those introductions. So do I need a motion for that? No, don't need a motion. Okay. So Chris, if you would, please introduce yourself and give our panelists an opportunity to introduce themselves to those who may not have met them yet.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Morris. Good morning. I'm Chris Domaleski with the Center for Assessment. Very pleased to be partnering with the department and the board to help this process, and glad to be here in person in Baton Rouge today. Glad to be able to meet in person folks that in some cases I've only had a chance to interact with remotely. Would love to have the distinguished panel introduce themselves. Maybe I'll just call them by name so we can organize the remarks. Dr. Cizik.
Good morning, Greg Cizik, University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and I'm pleased to be on the panel.
Great. Dr. Hovnitz.
Thanks, Chris. Christy Hovanitz, Senior Policy Fellow at Excel in Ed.
Great. Thank you, Christy. Dr. Russell.
I'm Mike Russell from Boston College, and glad to be here.
Dr. Don Francesco.
Hi, my name is Chris Donfrancesco. I'm glad to be here. I'm a senior policy analyst representing educators and just a JD. So happy to be with you all. Great. Thank you so much. And Dr. Brandt, my colleague at the center, would you want to greet folks this morning?
Good morning, Chris Brandt, associate at the center, and Chris's counterpart.
Great. That's our panel, Mr. Morris.
All right, great. And I don't want to leave our local expert out. So if you would, our colleague here from LDOE, if you would welcome, identify yourself for the crowd, please.
Sure. Thomas Lambert, Assistant Superintendent, Assessment, Accountability, and Analytics. And I would be remiss if I did not mention State Superintendent Cade Brumley, who's here with us, who has graciously assigned me to work with Mr. Morris and the rest of this advisory group to get this done. So appreciate him and all the superintendents who are here with us.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Lambert. Just a brief reminder for everyone. The objective here in general terms is to reach out to nationally recognized subject matter experts in this space, and to help us work with Mr. Lambert to establish a base case in layman's terms for the next BESE to understand the algorithm that's in place today for growth assessment in the state. And so with the work from this group, the next BESE will have base case established. They'll have an opportunity to look at base case. Is base case satisfactory, or do we need to be looking at other options? And then with this document in place, if the next BESE decides, we should be looking at other options, then all the due diligence has already been completed. And so they've got a complete list of all the demonstrated options that are available. And then the next BESE could make that decision, working with stakeholders to give consideration to another option. So I look forward to the discussion today from our panel, and obviously to the public comment following that. So let's move on now to approval of minutes. Can I get a motion? Dr. Davis, Dr. Bofi, thank you. Any objection? Hearing none, motion is passed. Next item is new business. First item is consideration of discussion regarding draft growth model priorities. Can I get a motion? Dr. Davis, Dr. Bofi, thank you. Chris, I think you have the ball.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Morris. And I know for those here in person, we've got the slides printed. I've also displayed that on the screen. Hopefully our panel can see that. And just as Mr. Morris teed up, I think we are This is our fourth of 4 meetings, and we've made some really strong progress, I think. And just to give folks an overview of what I hope we can accomplish today, what we want to do is make sure that we've refined the model priorities accurately. And so we're going to review those first, and I'd love to seek the panel and the board's feedback on that. And then in the second section of today's meeting, we'll apply those priorities to the different models we've considered, so that we've got good information to support the board's decision-making. We've gone through introductions, and we added this slide at the start to help us keep track of some important questions that we hope that we address in this process, and that you'll find in the report. And I don't know that I need to read all of them, but these questions remind us that what we're interested in is do we have technically defensible growth model alternatives? What adjustments might we need to make in order to make sure that it's functioning in a way that meets our priorities and matches the values of the department? If there are implementation challenges, and in some cases there are, you see one noted here related to, for example, creation of a vertical scale. We want to make sure we note those implementation challenges, so we'll be relying on the panel's advice and on our discussion to identify those along the way. And to the extent to which our decisions impact accountability outcomes that we value or that we might be concerned about, those too are things that we want to make sure we surface in conversation. So the materials today have been designed to help elicit those kinds of conversations, and we put these questions here to keep them in our forefront. As we've talked about in previous meetings, we know that there's not a single right way to approach academic growth, that there's not necessarily a gold standard, that's not a catalog we can look in and just pick a model, that we need priorities, we need to identify our values. Those are related to policy matters, practical, technical considerations. And in previous meetings, I think we've covered a lot of ground in helping sharpen our view of those priorities. And my colleague, Dr. Brandt, and I have gone through those previous meeting discussions and notes and tried to collapse the conversation into 5 core priorities. And what we'd like to do is share those with you this morning and seek the panel's feedback on whether or not you think we've captured them accurately. If there are additional priorities we need to add, if there are edits or revisions to these priorities, then we certainly want to make space to hear that. And then again, the reason this is so important is because we want to apply these priorities to the growth model alternatives that we'll explore in the next section of the meeting. So I'll invite conversation as we go. So maybe I'll just cover each priority, provide a little bit of context or background about it, pause, and then invite remarks from the board and from the panel. So the first priority, this is really intended to capture our conversation about norm versus criterion reference growth or growth to standard. We've talked about in previous meetings that there's at least 2 views of growth that tend to dominate our conversations when it comes to answering the question, what's good enough growth? What does it look like to have an adequate degree of academic growth demonstrated? One view is a normative view, where we say the growth is on par with what a group of academic peers would be expected to accomplish, or what would be typical for that group of academic peers. That's a lens that's prioritized approaches like growth percentiles and value-added models. And then there are criterion approaches that express growth related to an explicit performance standard. And that may be, for example, growth that's of a magnitude for a student to reach mastery in 3 years, or to reach advanced in X number of years. And I think what we've recognized is it doesn't always have to be a dichotomy, that you can endorse approaches that have elements of both approaches. And in fact, Louisiana's current application of the value-added model is an example of that, where I think there are both growth to standard and normative aspects of growth. So the criterion reference growth standard should define those good enough growth expectations, even while the normative approaches give us a sense for what's typical or what's expected based on an academic peer group. And so the first priority just says, let's look at solutions that balance those priorities. And I'm going to pause here and invite feedback from the board of the panel if regarding how well you think this priority reflects the conversations we've had to date.
Yeah, Chris, just to be clear, are you addressing that to the panel of experts, or are you addressing it to the board members, or both?
I'd be very pleased for either group to weigh in.
Can I ask a question around the kind of the point number 3 around reasonable time frame? And I just want to make sure that I have this correct in my head, because it's a memory from our discussion around changing accountability from a year ago. So is it true that if a student is unsatisfactory on their first LEAP test and they maintain or meet their adequate yearly progress to get to mastery on target, for a K-5 elementary school, they would still be a 0 on their LEAP score for the elementary school, because they're not going to meet that mastery target until 8th grade, because 8th grade is the ending point? Right, so they're growing, they're meeting their growth targets, but they're starting out unsatisfactory. They're meeting their growth towards mastery
They would
like
get,
they're supposed to, but they're still going to earn that K-5 school 0 for their LEAP score. The only way they're earning that school points is in the growth component. Is that correct?
right, because there's a assessment index that is how our students reaching basic, mastery, or advanced. So
Yep.
they haven't, so they're going to get a 0 in that component,
Mhm.
but in the growth component, they're getting 150.
Right. And so that's why it's really important that we think about why growth matters, right?
Yeah. And I think that what Chris is saying with in a reasonable time frame, he's talking about what is the time period in which you should expect a student to reach mastery. So you could think about it in 2 ways. Our current approach in step 1 divides the number of years.
Right.
So when you get to 7th grade to going to 8th grade, you have 1 year. So it's a very large number. A value table doesn't do that, but what it does say is you've got to move half an achievement level. So it's trying to signal the same behavior, but the value table solves you don't have a big goal in 1 year.
Year.
Our current approach says that if a student's not at mastery by 8th grade, they didn't reach their goal, because we've determined in our current system that good enough growth on that criterion measure is mastery by the time they get to 8th grade.
Okay.
So I think that's what Chris is trying to get at.
That's it. Okay. Thank you.
And Chris, I have a couple observations. I do think it reflects the conversation we've been having, but one of the priorities, and maybe you're going to get to it, is that the calculation is understandable, so people can understand what's happening in the calculation and can respond and react to it. And this seems that we're continuing to overcomplicate things with multiple ways of measuring it. And also with the normative approaches, it doesn't allow for schools to truly understand what they're going to be held accountable for until after the fact. So I think that some of the challenges here might play into, I think, maybe some of the other priorities that we may get into, if simplicity and transparency and actionable information is one of those things we're talking about. And then with respect to criterion versus normative growth, while normative growth can provide you a perspective of where you land compared to your peers, it still does not ensure that students are mastering the state's academic standards. So still a challenge that with normative growth, we still might not be able to make the progress that we're looking for to get kids to be able to master their state standards. So understand the priority, would be a little bit concerned if we continue to combine both of these and include both of these in the model, especially with some of the normative components and the expectations for just being better than peers.
Christy, thanks for that. I think those are really valuable additions. And you're right. We do have a priority. I think it's the very next one that's going to address priority 5. Okay. Priority 5. Maybe what I should have done is gone through all of them first. And so maybe when we address the comments here, we can go back and look at them all collectively. But I also wanted to just make a note. I take your point. It's a very persuasive one about not over relying on norms. But I just want to make sure that as we think about this as a panel for the board, for everybody that's engaged in this decision making, let's also think about those high achieving students and what our expectations there are as well. Because a lot of times a standards-based approach for high achieving students alone might actually set the bar lower than we would otherwise care about. That's where actually the norm approach gives us a picture about. So we want our high achieving students to continue to grow and not to languish, or at least that's a priority I would invite you to consider as we think about the interaction between norms and standards.
And just a brief comment here for everyone who may not be familiar with our process or expectations for the deliverable, but in our deliverable to the board at December BESE, we will list each of the options. And in addition to that, pros and cons, as Dr. Hovenetz has sort of kicked off here, pros and cons of each one. So just wanted to share that.
Dr. Cizik, I see you have your hand raised. Please go ahead.
I do. Thanks, Chris. I think what you've done here is good work. I like the overview. I'm interested to see the rest of the priorities. I think you did a good job on priority one. Without going back to the overview, I did want to add one sort of conceptual clarification, and I'll try and quote it. But one of the overview slides says something like, "Does the current model validly measure growth in the achievement of individual students?" That's something I think might need a bit of a clarification, because yeah, it's probably going to be valid, but every model is going to have some unreliability in terms of the measurement of growth for individual students. And the strength of these models is probably in the aggregation. You can make much more confident assertions about growth when you're talking about the growth of a group of students. That's why I think many of the models, probably aggregate up from the student to the classroom or the school. So if you want to, and that implication flows through to one of your other overview points, which was, does that suggest the changes that would meaningfully improve measurement in the system? And I think, I'll finally link that into priority one, which is, if you really want to know whether individual students are growing with respect to the standards, that's kind of a criterion reference system. And for that, you really need a testing system that's got like a pre-test at the beginning of the year and a post-test at the end of the year that drills down on the same kinds of objectives. And you can say, this student has moved from non-mastery on this to mastery on that. And you could do that fairly well if you had a reasonably long sort of criterion referenced instrument focused on the individual objectives that you want to measure. The other aspect of that is the accountability system. And for that, I think that's what these models are that we're going to be considering are really referring to. Largely norm referenced, I would classify them, but that's how you would look at growth in terms of an accountability system approach as opposed to individual student mastery.
Thank you, Greg. I appreciate that. Well, if there are no objections, perhaps what I should do is go through the other priorities collectively. So I realize that might help folks focus their remarks. So I'll continue through priorities 2 through 5, and then let's open it up for conversation again. Although if there are any clarifying questions or points along the way, please don't hesitate to ask me to pause. All right. Priority 2, all else being equal, we want to prioritize approaches that are more straightforward to understand and implement. So that gets to, I think, what Dr. Hovenetz was inviting us to make sure we include in her remarks. We've acknowledged in our previous conversations that complex models can be difficult to explain, difficult to provide support, monitor improvement, if they're inscrutable. On the other hand, I think we've recognized, and you're going to see some subsequent priorities, that there are technical characteristics and attributes that may be too important to set aside, and models that are overly simplistic may be too costly in that respect. So we don't want to sacrifice other important priorities, which is why we start this priority by saying, all else being equal, we want the solution that's more straightforward to understand and implement. So really we encapsulate it by saying what's the most efficient solution that honors the key priorities is how we've worded this. Priority 3 reads that the model should be technically defensible and produce sufficiently precise and comparable growth estimates. I don't think anybody would argue with the language about technical defensibility and precision. Comparability, I think, is something of a value judgment. And I've gathered from our previous conversations, it's one that we want to make sure that we put a stake on. So model should have a strong research base. It should be backed by credible research, whether that's through widespread application in other states, having gone through peer review, having information in respected journals. All of those would give us confidence that we've got an approach that has a research base. We want comparable levels of precision for all student groups and for the full range of performance. So for example, we wouldn't be pleased with a model that had precise estimates for students who are near mastery, but had a wide span of error for students that are at unsatisfactory levels or advanced levels. Now, it's just one of the facets of measurement. There's going to be some variation across the performance span, but we want to make sure that variation is within tolerance. So growth estimates should not have a low ceiling or a high floor. Some of this relates to the attributes of the assessment themselves, and we've talked about that. Folks may recall in our very first meeting, we looked at the properties of LEAP, and we asked ourselves if those properties were such that they would thwart our ambitions to measure growth with technical defensibility. And we also have named that estimates should be able to be meaningfully compared at the student and at the aggregate level, because that's one of the features for Louisiana's monitoring and accountability program that we want to make sure that we don't disrupt.
Chris, can you, for the folks who may not be familiar with the previous conversation, can you give us a little review on the terms here, low ceiling and high floor?
Thank you, Mr. Morris. By that, we mean if we've got a lot of clustering at the lowest levels of performance or at the highest levels of performance, then we're going to thwart our ability to measure growth. So if we can't distinguish degrees of low performance or degrees of high performance, then we're not going to be able to distinguish any kind of progress for those students over time. I think in Louisiana, we're particularly concerned about the lower performing students, and I know from my work with the Technical Advisory Committee that efforts are underway to amplify the information on the state test so that we can have more information or more sensitivity in that region. But that's what we mean by the low ceiling or high floor. Yeah, said another way, we just don't want clustering anywhere in the distribution. If you see large clumps that we can't disentangle degrees of difference, that works against our technical ambitions for measuring growth.
So we should have appropriate resolution at both extremes.
Yes, sir. Exactly. And this really unpacks this a little bit more, priority 4. And we've packed a lot in this priority, and I'll ask the panel's advice to help us make sure this is clear. We want to prioritize models that more fully differentiate performance. And I think there's a couple of aspects to this that are baked into this priority. We want the model to produce results that are sensitive to meaningful progress or declines in performance. So stated another way, you want the needle to move. When students exhibit academic growth, we want the model to show that. We want that needle to move. And so for that reason, we want more granular information over more coarse approaches. The other aspect of this is growth should differentiate across other measures. So for example, if the model is highly correlated with assessment scores or with status, then it doesn't offer new and distinct information about progress. So if you told me, for example, that growth estimates are correlated at 0.9 or higher with the percent of students at mastery or higher in every school, I'd probably tell you, well, then I don't need both measures. They're doing the same thing. So we want growth to give us a distinct view of academic progress that's disentangled from other measures. And we also want appropriate sensitivity across the scale. So we've tried to really put both of those priorities in this one category where we say we want to more fully differentiate performance. Now, again, I'm not suggesting this alone is the basis on which you make decisions. What I'm suggesting, and I think this picks up from the panel's advice in previous conversations, that this is another of the things we want to look at when we interrogate models. We want to look at differentiation, and we want to look at relationship to other measures of academic performance that we care about, and ask ourselves, are we getting something that's distinct, and are we getting something that differentiates?
Can you provide an example?
See, I think in the first meeting, we looked at a correlation between SPS scores and growth scores, and we saw that correlation was weakly positive, which is about the target. We're not going to get that to zero, almost certainly, but if we had two models and all else were equal, and one was weakly correlated and the other was strongly correlated, the one that's more weakly correlated is offering new, distinct information about performance that might be. It's another way to really address what I think some people would call a fairness criterion. They'd say, if I've got a school that's serving very diverse students from typically underserved backgrounds, I want to know that their growth scores aren't predetermined, that that we can differentiate for that group of students just as well as we can for students who may be in a more affluent school community.
Chris, I agree that having indicators that differentiate is really important, but looking at correlation alone, I think we need to be careful. Just because I know, reading scores and math scores are highly correlated, but I wouldn't want to ditch math scores because they're not telling us something different than reading scores are. And so I want to be sure that we're also looking at what the indicator and the information is. And even if it is correlated to another indicator, that we're not excluding it just simply because of a high correlation. So just making sure that we're not getting rid of indicators just because they're highly correlated with something else. And I don't think that's the intent here, but just want to be very clear that sometimes we measure things even if they are highly correlated with something else because we still value them and think they're important.
Thank you, Chrissy. I think it's a persuasive point, and it reminds us that collectively these priorities will to some degree clang. And that's why this is such a difficult task. We might feel like one priority is very well represented with the solution, but that works against another. And I think you're right, Christy. I think if we put too much emphasis on it, it could work against other priorities like the growth to standard priority that we value as well. And the last priority is that the model should be transparent and configurable. This is another that's related to implementation. And this is something I've sensed from the start of my work in Louisiana, and I think continues to come through in my conversations with Louisiana policymakers. We want a model that users can inspect the results, can replicate the results. Black box solutions are not desirable in this case because we want people to be able to know what's going on and to be able to configure. So if we want to make changes, we can make changes. And it's worth noting because there are some growth approaches in place in other states where they are proprietary commercial solutions where policymakers say, we want to make that tweak, then that wouldn't be acceptable because they've, quote, purchased a commercial alternative. So the model should be configurable to help education leaders make changes if they're desirable in the future. And so we wanted to note that as one of our implementation priorities. So I've done a lot of talking. Folks have been patient as I've gone through all 5 priorities. So let me open it up broadly to the panel, to the board for feedback. Is there anything you expected to hear that you didn't? Is there something that we framed that you feel is not as clear or not as accurate as you would hope it to be? We want to listen and learn to get these right. Christine, please go ahead.
Hi there. Thank you so much. And I apologize that my camera is not on, but I just wanted to jump in and say how greatly as educators, I appreciate the focus on transparency if we're going to be, analyzing and doing all of this work to calculate growth, the public as well as educators should be able to consume that information in a way that is relevant and useful. And on balance, I do think that educators will really appreciate the focus and priority for that. If a growth score should provide information that is distinguishable from and not redundant to the assessment results themselves, right? If we're going to calculate growth, it should provide more information in a separate, meaningful way that is useful to educators so that they can propel learning for students. So I think that you did an amazing job capturing the priorities, and I just want to thank you, because having balanced, well-rounded information that provides various pieces of information that's useful to educators is extremely important and helpful. And it also, frankly, recognizes the incredible efforts that they put in, where, it might not be immediately recognizable in some of the assessment scores directly, but a great responsible growth metric will. So thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for your comment.
Dr. Brophy.
Thank you. So it's really important to me, and I think what we've seen historically in Louisiana is that our accountability system has helped to drive improvement. And so I'd like to talk about how that might fit in relative to a priority. So I think all of the things here are important, but I think connected to some of the things that you're saying relative to clarity for people being able to consume the information is, how does it also help us go to the next level in Louisiana?
Dr. Brophy, I guess the word that strikes me from your question is there any incentives in place? Is that where you're going, or somewhere else?
No, it's not so much about the incentive. I mean, maybe it is, and that's why I really appreciate that we're able to have this conversation and we're able to have it with people who think so deeply about all of this. And I know an accountability system has incentives, but what I would hope, right, is for let's say a third grade teacher to be able to look at the system and say, okay, based on this information, I know what I need to do and I know where I need to focus. And where I think we struggle is by not being clear to people with what they need to focus on. And then when people get overwhelmed and they get discouraged, we don't get their best work. So how is it that we can be clear with the information, and maybe for an individual teacher, that might be too ambitious, right? Like it may be too ambitious for the system to communicate something to an individual teacher, but could the system communicate something to a principal who's trying to prioritize their spending and trying to help their school know where they can focus to grow?
Dr. Murphy, I appreciate that comment. I think that's really important. And I think that invites us to make sure we sharpen that in the priorities. Maybe it could reside under priority 2, or maybe we just need to make that a separate priority, that it's actionable, that it's useful, that it's clear, that educators, policymakers, that users feel that the results are very clear and well designed to be used for the purposes that they want to prioritize. So, I really appreciate that comment, and I feel like at a minimum that's something that needs to be sharpened in the priorities, if not represented as a standalone priority. But I would invite others to weigh in on that, because that is something that I have heard very clearly from the panel from day one, and I think you're giving voice to something very important here. I'll just say on a technical thing, I don't know why, but my computer dropped. I don't think the meeting dropped remotely. So if folks are wondering what's happening online, I'm trying to get reestablished, but that doesn't disrupt the meeting, I think. And I think everybody has a hand up on the panel. So I want to, is that, I did want Dr. Bofi to invite a reaction to that. If that's something that we either clarify in the priorities or add as an additional priority, is that something that you think is a reasonable response?
I appreciate the reference to the term actionable. I like that.
And I mean, I won't be here to do the work, but I would want, I know that you will, Mr. Morris, Mr. Castile will be here, Ms. Holloway will be here to do the work. And so I think it's a conversation is, does it need to be pulled out as a separate priority so that it doesn't get lost? And I say that especially because in order to have the kind of system we have to invest significant dollars in testing. If we're investing those significant dollars, they need to be paying off in more improvement, right? Like we shouldn't just hold this up as, hey, this is how we are. Here's some information. If it's not useful, that's going to help us better educate the kids right in front of us or kids in the future, then I think we have to start questioning those investments. And so I'm not sure what it'll take so that this doesn't get lost, but I certainly don't want it to be lost. And I, would be interested to see what the experts have to say about that or where they've seen that really happening. Because I think overall as a state, we can point to some significant improvements as a result of a couple of decades of hard work that our accountability system played a role in. So I want us to be able to, with any kind of revisions that we make, I want us to be able to say, we had this information, we had it in a form that was useful enough that educators could use it and do a better job serving kids. Because if not, then I think then we have to start asking ourselves harder questions about the investments we make.
I think that's well said.
I wonder, is that a reference to the test or is it a reference to the growth assessment? Just trying to put more focus on your comment. And for me, I go back to the test, and personally, I really like the approach that the state is taking now with regard to literacy and the diagnostic component. So we can identify where it's appropriate for interventions, make sure those interventions are happening, and then be able to follow up and assess then whether or not those interventions have been effective or not.
Well, I think that's why it's so important to me as a priority in that all of the decisions we make and all of the things that we do is that we're not just doing this for the sake of doing it, but we're doing it to help drive improvement, right? Like I just don't go to the doctor to find out that I'm sick. I mean, I know I'm sick when I go to the doctor. I want information that's going to help me get better. And so I think that we would have to apply that filter to every piece of our work.
Yeah. And I wonder if some of it is, how do we disaggregate the information? Like we create a progress index, which is the combination of ELA and math, and we never publish how ELA looks and how math looks, and they look very different. And the way that we're not disaggregating it, it doesn't give the educators the information. They think, oh, this is our progress index, but their ELA progress index might be through the roof and one of the best in the state, but their math progress index might be really low, and the information we're giving doesn't help them do that. But we could give it to them if we talked about what the right thing is that they need.
And I mean, you're just convincing me that it needs to be pulled out as a priority that we continue to hold in front of us.
Yep.
And, when we first started this, right, when ESSA was passed and we first started this, we started having conversations about growth. And what I had in my mind is, I would look at a school letter grade, but that is different. Like right before, as a BESE member, right before I walk into school, it's like, okay, let me see where the school is. With a progress index, at least I know the trajectory and the direction that they're going. So I feel like that was an improvement that we made with this particular part of the system. For any changes going forward, it's like, how can we get even better about supporting people in making good decisions? Because I mean, just like going back to health, if like the one thing I need to do is exercise, then let's make it clear that I need to exercise, right? If the one thing that people need to do, or the most important thing they need to do, is focus on math skills, let's make that clear. Like take out all the guessing, be as clear as you can be, because this work is really hard, right? Because you have all of the children who are coming in. I mean, when you're working with humans, they come with a whole bunch of complex issues. This stuff needs to be as simple as possible. There shouldn't be a guessing game.
Great, thank you. I think all of our panel have their hands raised. Greg, you look you've leaned in particular, so go ahead. Greg, we're not hearing you.
Anything now?
We got you now.
Okay. I apologize. I don't know the name of the board member who's just speaking, but I want to sort of second that idea that perhaps it should be a separate point of its own. This notion that you had in the priority number 2 that complex models maybe should be avoided because you want something that's easy to explain. I wrote down as you were going through that they need to be easy to respond to, right? People need to know what to do next based on that information. And then I thought about easy to respond to. Sometimes in our experience, and you'll know this, Chris and Chris and others, that overly simplistic models can be gamed, meaning if you find out that you get points for the number of students who are in a proficient category, and you have a few students just below the proficient line, if you focus all your effort on those 3 students and get them into the proficient category, you get some points in the accountability system, which is really a corruption of what you want an incentive to be for educators with a classroom full of students. So if a standalone slide, and I know I'm getting really into the weeds on that, but just speaking concretely, if a standalone point is that the system should be easy to respond to, it should be actionable, to use the chair's terminology, and it should be such that it's as immune as possible to gaming. I think that would be a really important contribution. And as long as I have the floor, I'll mute myself shortly, but I have 2 other responses. One to priority 3 about reasonably comparable. I would caution the state to look, if there is a change, for reasonable comparability sort of over time. I think it'll be very traumatic to the education system if you have one accountability model in place that places all these schools in a high category, an A category, B category, and a lot of schools in a low category, and then that's all disrupted. That shifts dramatically. All these schools that were in a high category fall into a low one. All the low ones go into a high one. I think that will maybe to some extent impugn the public credibility of the new model. So I would be cautious about that. And then finally, I agreed with number 5 about the proprietary models. I'll just say this: I'm not a vendor, but vendors spend a lot of their own resources to develop and refine models that they just have the horsepower and the experience and the research staff that probably go beyond what an individual state can do in terms of researching and refining a model. So I agree that point number 5, that those kinds of things should be downweighted a little bit. The sense to which they're not open, that they're not configurable. I support that they should be configurable. I would just urge caution not to in whole cloth throw out any kind of proprietary or commercial solution.
Great, thank you. Ton of great advice there that will help us improve these priorities. I don't know who is next. I see Mike and Christy both have their hands up. So Mike, I don't think we've heard from you yet. So why don't you go ahead?
All right. So this is pretty quick. And I think I suspect this is what we're going to be talking about next. But there's tension between these priorities. And because they're numbered, that could create a perception that some priorities have higher ranking than others. So I don't think that's the intent by putting numbers on there, but I do think we need to be aware that there's likely to be tension and that we probably won't be able to meet all priorities at the same level of achievement, if you will. Just an observation, and again, something I'm sure we'll be talking about in a few minutes.
Mike, thanks for that. And Immediately what that makes me think of a way we can improve the advice that comes out of this process is to just explicitly note that they're not meant to represent a hierarchy, and note these tensions, which you're right, we are going to see how those play out against various alternatives very shortly. But at a minimum, I think we have to be clear to guard against some implications of these priorities that aren't intended. Christy, thanks for being patient. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Dr. Boffey, absolutely agree with your points on what do we do with this information and how do we improve schools. And I think Thomas made a really good point in his response, was being able to transparently share and disaggregate that information, breaking out the math versus reading in that achievement index is important. Being able to break out math versus reading growth is going to be really important. But the one thing I will caution is I don't think our accountability systems are going to ever be able to tell us exactly what to do. And I don't necessarily think that they should. The accountability system really is a check on the system and to be used for higher level decisions, and to really investigate, if you do have lower math scores, what should be done. And that might not be the same for every school. At some schools, it might be, oh, we're not spending as much time on math as we are on other subjects. Maybe we need to increase the amount of time, and that will help us. Maybe it's curriculum. Maybe you don't have the right math series in the school and you need to work on or change that. Or maybe it's the teachers haven't been fully prepared on how to teach math and might need some help coaching. So I don't think the accountability system is designed and probably shouldn't provide the very specific answers of what should be done instructionally, but should point the school in the right direction to create a good school improvement plan and where to direct their resources. So just want to be sure that we aren't expecting too much from the accountability system, but that we're getting the right information to be able to turn it over to the districts in the school and maybe even the state for some guidance and direction on where to provide those resources and technical assistance and the right questions to ask to make sure that students are getting what they need if we see deficient reading scores or deficient math scores or having trouble with achieving the graduation rate expectations.
Thank you. Very, very helpful. Yes, sir.
Christy, I appreciate your comments. I wonder if that's just very counter to what we have, because we assign letter grades and we have the details that informs schools, districts, the state in terms of how we might use data to improve. But going back to Dr. Boffey's comment, generally what we do is when we go into a school, we quickly go to the internet and say, is this an A, B, or C school, and make judgments about that. So I'm trying to reconcile on one hand, the need to look at that data and drill into it, but as a practical matter, because we do assign letter grades, not that I'm saying we shouldn't do that, but I'm just thinking about what you just said and what happens as a practical matter, because when letter grades come out, the top districts quickly promote it and say we're the best in the state, and everyone brags about their performance or lack thereof. And I'm wondering if we're achieving what you are suggesting, because it seems to do something a little bit different in the way we assign letter grades and how people respond to it.
That's a good statement. In my experience, I think that's kind of the point of letter grades, is to draw people in to be excited about what grade did we earn this year. And if it's an A, we do want them to celebrate because they put in a lot of hard work and they achieved some pretty great things, especially if you have a rigorous expectation for earning an A. On the flip side, if they didn't earn an A, if they earned a C or a D or an F, what is it that they have to do in order to improve or increase that grade? But those letter grades really draw people in to look at that information a little bit closer and a little bit more detailed to be able to change what happens in the coming years. So I think that's kind of the point or purpose of having that overall rating, is to draw people in and draw attention to that information. And if it is an A school, we want we want them to celebrate. And we also want to be able to get that information to them at the very beginning of summer or as early as we can, so they can make decisions about how to improve and change and development of teachers and bringing in coaches and curriculum changes and decisions over that summer, so they have a time period there. So that's one of the things maybe too in the priorities that I was looking at, is the timing of this information. If we want it to be actionable and we want it to be used by schools and districts, we have to give them the opportunity to get that information in a timely way to make adjustments specifically for the next year. So also making sure that we're providing that in a way that they can use it when they have time to.
Right.
Christy, I wonder if I can follow up on your point and ask you a question. You know, that the ABCD system, I don't think actually serves educators that well as a finer grained system that would point to areas of strength, areas of weakness, areas that need to be improved. But you know, that finer grain is, I think, what we've been talking about when we talk about it's actionable and it's something that educators can use. Something I think the board will have to wrestle with is there are really two different audiences and two different kinds of information. The finer grain information that's more actionable is good as a communication tool with educators. I see ABCD systems and so forth to be more actionable, if you will, for the public. You know, they want to understand how schools are performing, and fine grain information is essentially useless to the average parent in terms of, you know, what kind of actionable stuff a school might do to improve. They want to know, and I think the level that at which they can access and understand an accountability system is along the lines of a very simple system like an ABCD system, where they can say, the school my kid's going to is doing a great job. End of story. I mean, that's about as far down as they might want to drill if they're evaluating their school that the child attends, or they're considering a school for their child to attend. So I think the board will have to wrestle with who's the real audience for the accountability system. And if there's two audiences, then there might be two different cuts of information that need to be provided.
Yeah, I'll add a perspective here. And I know we're not explicitly charged with interrogating the A through F system, and there's probably a range of opinions about that on the panel. But I think the big point that I would just want to contribute to this conversation is that I'll make the claim that grades alone don't carry meaning, that you have to assign meaning to those grades. They don't carry any more meaning than, say, a 5-star system does that some states use or something like that. That we have to explicitly say, what are the characteristics of an A school, or what are the characteristics of a growth? So only through clearly defining these levels do people find it to be meaningful and actionable. And I think that that's what takes us back to the principles here.
Chris, I really appreciate that last comment. It's something I've given a lot of thought to over my term on the board. And that is defining, if we're going to go with, we're going with the letter grade system, then should we do a little better job of defining each one? What are the characteristics of an A school? What are the characteristics of a B school, and so forth? And so we set expectations for the culture, and, expectations within the culture. So I really appreciate that comment. And then I had a couple of others. Want to make sure, I think maybe Dr. Bophy mentioned this one, in addition to Christy, and that is the benefit of the timeliness. Heard a lot of comments over these 4 meetings about the value here and getting that information back in a timely manner. So I want to make sure we capture that. And then another one that I think Dr. Bophy brought out also that I really think is significant is identifying the supports that we need. So with Mr. Castile's comments, I think we all like to join the party and celebrate the A's and the B's. But reality is we do have some D's and some F's. And so we need to recognize, in my view, we need to recognize those D's and F's, but we need to understand what kind of supports they need so they can move into the 3rd quartile, the 2nd quartile, and so forth. So I wonder if there's any room in this conversation to address or help identify from the test results what kind of supports would be identified based on the outcome of the test results.
And I've just made a note that I think that is coupled well with a lot of the advice we're hearing about actionability. We've heard several examples of how things can be more actionable. The grain size, the context, for example, Christy said, you know, you need ELA, you need math, you need it for the areas of which you value at the grain size that's going to be helpful. You need it in a timely basis. And then I think what you're offering, Mr. Morris, which I think is a very important extension of this, we need to know how that connects with the plan to deploy supports to really help improve. And again, some of this gets beyond, and I think Christy also made this point earlier on, that we can't ask too much of the accountability system itself. We have to respect how the accountability system is situated within a larger network of initiatives here at the department for how we support student success. But acknowledging that, I think, is a contribution.
I think you make another good point there, that the next board needs to understand, you know, what the limitations of the growth assessment are, right? It's not the one all solve all for everything. We should have some appreciation for what expectations are, for what it can do, what it can't do. So I thought that was a really good point. Thank you.
Dr. Russell, please go ahead.
Yeah, Chris, you know, just listening to this conversation, it makes me wonder if the priority focus, I can't remember if it exists or we're adding it, but the, you know, priority focus on actionable. If that may be a little too optimistic, and that really, you know, when we think about an accountability system and the information provided by it, I'm not sure any of it is going to be actionable given the level of aggregation that's going on, but it could point people in good directions. Mm-hmm. Right. So, and maybe that's an action, turning and looking in a direction you can think as being actionable. But, you know, I think it would be a mistake to think that you could take any information in that accountability system and go out and take action tomorrow. I think the best we're going to be able to do is help people, point people in directions to figure out what actions they might want to take.
Mike, I appreciate that point. It's nuanced, but I think it's massively important. And I think I'm hearing it as a rejection of a theory of action that if you just report the right stuff, people will know what to do and they'll do awesome things. And I think what you're reminding us is that's an incomplete theory of action, that maybe what we could do is meet the prerequisites for actionability by having at the grain size, the context, the timeliness, but that has to interact with a larger system of supports, initiatives, and contributions in order to see the outcomes we like. So yeah, that's a nuance I think we ought to make sure we address clearly in our report. So I appreciate that.
And I would appreciate really drilling down on that, because I want to make sure I understand that, because as a practical matter, what happens is when scores come out, schools do, and school districts, but schools in particular, look at their scores and they look into the details. So for example, you dropped in terms of ACT performance. I think the school will then reflect on, well, why did that happen? Is it something that we did? Is it something about the school population? What adjustments can we make as a result of it? So certainly to some degree, as the system is designed to do, schools will analyze, particularly when there are major swings. If there is a big drop or a big gain, it draws one's attention to what happened last year compared to this year. The timing is important because by the time grades come out, you're halfway through the next year. So there isn't much time to make an adjustment. But I suspect that that's exactly what schools do, is they look and self-reflect and think about what adjustments they need to make in response to scores. And sometimes they might just chuckle, because going back to, I think it was Greg's comment about the ability to game the system or not game the system and understand that, well, I've only got 3 students here that if I did or did not have or move or didn't move, I can increase my score in this area or not. And so there is a bit of an inherent corruption in the system in that way, because there are ways to figure out how to make adjustments here and there. And then schools have to make value adjustments or judgments about how to make those adjustments. So I really appreciate the analysis once you get to that.
Yeah, I think Mike and Christie's points mesh well together. But it's about the grain size of actionability, right? If you get information that says your ACT scores went down, that's actionable at a sort of course level. But as Christie points out, it doesn't tell you whether you discontinued the ACT prep course that you were offering. Maybe that had something to do with it. You changed your course. The teacher who was teaching core subjects that the ACT is met, all that kind of stuff. It doesn't tell you exactly where to go to. So I don't think we can expect a super fine grain level of actionability based on any system. And it's more going to be like along the lines of what Mike suggested, which is sending people in a direction to begin to look for what, as professional educators, they know might be the usual suspects or the likely sources of concern or success in their school.
Yeah, I think this, I think your example is very clarifying, so I appreciate that. And it just reminds us that when educators, when leaders see movement in scores, so they see, for example, a dip in growth or an ACT performance, there's a range of actions that's going to inspire, and it's really those actions that are moving the needle. So, and certainly if in the conversation we're not talking about teaching and learning, then we've lost the plot at some point. But I think what I hear the panel saying is, let's not load too much on the analytics alone as a path to improvement, but let's just recognize the kinds of supports and actions that they're intended to inspire. And so again, I don't want to get the scope of this to grow in ways that aren't intended, but I think what I hear from the panel and from all of these really very helpful contributions is, let's just make sure we right-size growth and accountability in this, in our recommendations and in the report.
Yeah. Can I highlight just one more time that the timing in which we release this data? Because if you get it in November, again, you're halfway through the school year,
right?
And the ability to make any adjustments mid-year is extremely difficult to do. The information is very, very helpful to have, but I know it's been an ongoing conversation. But want to underscore one more time that getting it in November is not as helpful as it would be if we got it at the end of the school year or early in the summer.
Chris, maybe we can put a pro-con list. There's a lot of reasons that I think that once you heard, for example, we could shave weeks and weeks off of school performance score release if we didn't give school systems weeks to review their data, verify exit reasons, all of those things. The result would be that most school systems would see, or many schools would see, a slightly lower school performance score because they didn't have an opportunity to apply exit reasons a second time, legitimate reasons for not testing a second time. We can go through and make a list of all of those things and how much time we think we could shave off of that. But there would be a lot of things to discuss, and we would just have to weigh that against that priority for time.
That's helpful. Thank you.
I have a follow-up question to that, though. Is there a way that you could do like a school system release earlier to where they would have the data that you're talking about and then be able to make the improvements that they need to make before you, make an official release? So essentially like some preliminary scores that could help leaders as they're finalizing their budgets and identifying how they're going to prioritize staffing. If there was a preliminary release to the educators, let them work through the data, get all that cleaned up, and then knowing that it's the responsibility of the state to have a public release that is going to come later and where the data would be cleaner.
Potentially. it could create a little bit more confusion, but we can put that as a pro and con also.
Thank you.
Chris, can I just I've been thinking a lot about what you said around, the letter grade system and whether or not it's inherently meaningful, right? That really what the letter grade should represent, or a set of characteristics that we think an A school ought to exemplify. And I think that's really important to think about, in light of the fact that over the next 2 years, we are changing the cutoffs for all of our letter grades. And so a school that is an A this year might very well, with the same SPS score, be a B next year. And what characteristic has actually changed around that school? And so I think that it does kind of present, I guess, kind of discontinuity or confusion among the public about what's going on in our school systems. Are these letter grades ever going to be meaningful when we keep changing exactly what cut points are, and the schools are still doing exactly the same work? And so I just think that to me, that comment really resonated around what are the characteristics outside of just this number that really exemplify what we want a high performing school to look like.
Thank you. I think another example of that we find in one of the questions we were invited to think about. I'm looking at the questions we started with. How can we adjust our measurement or policy to ensure that a school that earns an A for growth does not receive an overall F school rating? And I don't know how much time we want to spend on that specific question, but I think more broadly, and maybe we do want to lean into that question, but more broadly, I think it's an invitation for us to think, well, what's the role of growth when it comes to understanding letter grade performance? How do we feel about schools that are high on growth, but maybe lower on status or other indicators, or flip that, high on status, low on growth? And I don't think there's a single right answer. I would just submit defining that and making sure those definitions are operationalized becomes a very important task with any growth model or with any initiative of this nature.
Do we have examples from any other states where those characteristics are defined?
So most states use a composite score, which is what Louisiana uses as well, which is to say that indicators have values. Those values get combined with in accordance to weights, but that does mean that higher performance on one thing can offset performance on another thing, and sometimes to a troubling degree. So people might observe, for example, hey, I would expect a school at this level of growth to score higher than it does, but it doesn't have enough weight, or it doesn't offset to the degree that they would otherwise want. There are other ways to combine, like using performance profiles, and there are some states that do essentially an accountability standard setting, not unlike an assessment standard setting. So again, I don't want to have us go too far afield, but with assessments, you might ask the same question. Well, how do we come up with this number for advanced or this number for mastery? And the answer to that question is, well, a panel of experts got together. They looked at the academic performance standards in Louisiana. They looked at the content of this assessment, and they said, when students must know and be able to do these things, we see it demonstrated with this kind of performance on the test. So we know the line goes here. A similar process can be implemented for accountability, where we say, let's have a portrait or a profile of a school that we think exemplifies A. And we know there's lots of ways to get there, but let's at least name one or a small number of those ways to get there. And let's ensure that our system is operationalized in a way to recover that. And you can do the same for B, C, and the other. There's a small number of states that have done this, quote, accountability standard setting. I recently worked with Kentucky on their system. Utah's done this. So we could provide some reports or some information about that, but that's how some states are thinking about it.
I do want to provide, because I was on the board when we developed this version of the accountability system, which was better than the last version, right? And just as my hope that this next version will be better than the version we have now. And what we talked about relative to defining the A school was that, and it was pointing towards 2025, right? And so I think it's good that we're having this conversation now, because the purpose was getting us to look towards 2025. That felt a long way away in 2015, I think, is when we did it. So, but what we talked about was that an A school would be a school where the majority of the students are on track for mastery, right, of the skills. And so now I don't know how true that held in the system that we have today, but it is why, and then going back to something that that Chris brought up earlier is, it may have been one of the panelists brought up, is that there was a gradual increase in what it would take to be an A school, right? To where we're going towards the 100, you'd have to have the 100 to be an A school. There was a gradual increase to get there so that we wouldn't throw the system off. And that comment did come from somebody online, right? Because you don't want to send everybody into panic. So that's something I just want to orient you guys in where we were thinking about it. I don't know that it held true, right? Like that's the reality of life. You can have the best ideas and do the best work you can do, but you may not achieve what you're trying to achieve. The other thing I just want, and I think this is important context for the panelists who are on the line, is I think you all know we're a poor state, right? We serve students who are economically disadvantaged in our public schools to a greater extent because of the reality of poverty in the state of Louisiana. So how do we make sure we're not just identifying socioeconomic status with our accountability system? And so I know there's the point about norm referenced and criterion reference. I'm not a statistician or an expert in these things, but I do know one of the biggest complaints against accountability systems is, if you're basically just filtering poverty, right? And if that's all we do, we're not really giving people actionable information. And I think actionable information actually matters, because the people I want to be around and the people that make me most excited are the ones who have students who are in poverty and come from the greatest need, but they're making a difference in their life. And that's what I love about the added part of the Every Student Succeeds Act and people actually putting that emphasis and that focus on growth. So I, been on the board for a while and wanted to make sure I shared that.
Christine, I see you put a comment in the chat. Did you want to give voice to that?
Hi, thank you. I can. I think that the conversation has kind of already covered the comment, but I would just say, we really appreciate the consideration of educators and what information is relevant to helping ensure that educators can provide every opportunity to students and every resource to students that they need to be successful. At the end of the day, the growth indicator as part of an accountability system, my understanding is that it should serve to identify gaps and opportunities for groups of students in a school, in a district, and perhaps across the state. At the classroom level and for the individual, we talked a little bit about the third grade educator, right, was mentioned earlier, I think in Dr. Brophy's comments. Those indicators, right, that metric from growth and the overall accountability rating, we talked about the timing. Given how it comes out, these are just two pieces of information that can help sort of memorialize and summarize what's going on. And I do think that's part of why I so appreciate distinguishing and making sure that growth is not redundant to test scores alone, that it provides an additional facet of information, but it's one of a myriad of factors. And for educators who are engaging in day-to-day teaching and learning with students, the most perfect growth indicator, the most perfect accountability system in the world is still not going to be able to, it's still just going to be one piece of information along with formative assessment, observation, the narrative feedback that an educator gives a student in real time, the ongoing process of teaching and learning. So I just want to make sure that as educators, we're properly contextualizing it. But I thank everyone for their comments because I did very much hear those considerations. Thank you, Chris.
So perhaps what I'll attempt to do now is to summarize some of the high level things that have come up in this section of our meeting today. And maybe that'll take us to a break if that's agreeable with the chair. And then we can move to the next section of our agenda on the other side of the break. But this was very, very helpful. I thank the panel. I thank the board for all these contributions. In no particular order, some of the contributions that I wanted to make sure I really follow up on. First, we need to make sure we put these priorities in context. So I think we need a separate section in our final report that clarifies things like these aren't intended to be hierarchical and certainly not according to the number system, and also puts in context the role and the place of growth in the accountability system as separate from the range of critical supports and resources that go into teaching and learning that really move the needle on student achievement. So a couple of things, just making sure that we place the priorities in context and guard against some unintended interpretation of those priorities. With respect to the priorities themselves, we had a lot of conversation about actionability. The more I think about it, the more I think that really has to reside as a separate statement. And we said there's just things we need to name that are prerequisites to using growth information in meaningful, actionable ways. And we said things like context and grain size and timing and relationship to support. So I think that's something we need to put in text in our report because it's just too important, I think, to assume it's implied in one of the other priorities. Greg made a very important point about comparability that I think we need to add. And I don't, again, know that we've come to a decision about comparability, but I think what he's inviting us to do is name that if we do go with an approach that disrupts comparability over years, that is itself a cost. And it's something that we ought to at least have our eyes open about. So that's something that I think would be incomplete if we don't put that in our report. We also talked about, and again, I think this might be part of the last priority, or it might exist as a part of priority 2, that the system needs to be robust to thwarting corruptibility or gaming. And I don't think we otherwise named that. I think the panel called that out as something that we need to be able to address in the report. And I think that covers a lot of the big points. Let me just pause here and say, panel colleagues, what do you want to make sure I don't miss here, our board members, as we think about revising these priorities for our report?
I was looking for I guess one clarification, and then I had a question. The 6 bullets on slide 6 with the questions, is the intent that our distinguished panel is going to help us answer those questions, or are these questions that the next BESE should be considering, or what specifically are these questions purposed for?
I think we'll make our analysis of how the different models stack up to the priorities should cover a lot of them. So for example, we're going to talk about vertical scaling and assessment properties and the like on the other side of the break when we evaluate these priorities against the different models. I honestly think the one thing that I don't know that we've covered enough and that I'm not anticipating being a separate part of the report is the relationship of growth to the broader accountability system. And I'm really looking at that last bullet. And I don't know, Thomas, if you want to give us a perspective on that, but I think what you're reminding us of here is that there are some specific questions that sparked conversations about growth that we want to make sure we try to make some progress on.
Yeah, I think our hope would be that that the report would include some information about what to consider around what does it mean to be the conversation about the letter grade scale, all of that stuff that we discussed today, I think is a key part of answering that question. A, growth, F, overall letter grade, and provide the next board kind of jumping off point of like questions to think about and answer, because that policy decision you could solve through a handful of very straightforward policy decisions. There are consequences that the board is going to have make a decision on the values that they have to support that.
Okay.
So that is there just as a reminder about that this does sit in the middle of a letter grade system. And if a school is an A for growth, should they be in the highest level of intervention needed, which is how you wind up there with an F overall letter grade. Does that help?
It does. Thank you.
And then the question I had, that I don't think we spoke to yet, maybe we're going to get to it in the next session, is Mr. Lambert and I have had some extensive conversations about, if we look at the student population in the state and those clusters that were referenced before, we know that 60% or so of our student population has not achieved mastery yet. Obviously we're expectations are they're going to get there. But how do we, I guess the first question would be, are we today, do we have enough resolution in the current assessment system so that with so many students that are 1 or 2 or more years below grade level, do we have a system in place today that accurately assesses their growth towards grade level as they make that move towards mastery? But if they're not starting, at the current grade level, and we're not tracking growth from there, because those students haven't reached that point yet, do we have a system in place today that does capture growth from where an individual student starts, regardless of where that start point is, to where they end up at the end of the school year?
Chris, do you want to tackle that during the gain score discussion?
I think we can do that. And I think that's the first priority is really meant to capture that nuance, that those are really the two levers, the norm and the growth to standard, and I think balancing those two is the lens through which I would look to answer that very important question. Everybody wants growth expectations that are ambitious but attainable. And I think I think that invites us to calibrate correctly with respect to norms and criteria.
And I want to be clear, I don't want to confuse goals with measurement. To me, those are two different things.
That's fair.
So I think we should have an appropriate resolution for measurement, and we should have aggressive goals. But given the student population that we have, and where that cluster, if you will, exists today, I think we want to make sure that we've got accurate measurement.
Yeah, I think that as we go into a break, the panel, I think the question when we get to the gain score discussion and the vertical scale is, Mr. Morris and I have talked a lot about what do you need in order to measure student progress when they are so far below grade level. So if you're a 5th grade student taking the 5th grade test, and the last time you tested, you were probably somewhere around 3rd grade in terms of ability level, do you need to have 3rd and 4th grade off level items and a vertical scale to really measure that improvement? And I think that's the question that Mr. Morris is hoping that we'll have a little resolution on and include in the report. So that would be something that keep in the back of y'all's minds as you're taking a break.
Okay. Mr. Chair, is it okay if we adjourn to a break?
Well, actually, we want to follow public meeting law. We want to provide opportunity for public comment. So if there's any public comment on this item, here's your opportunity.
I will fill out a card. My name is Michael Falk. I'm executive director of the State Superintendent Association, but I'm speaking as Michael Falk, former superintendent. 31 years ago, we started school accountability in this state. I was there on the ground level, and I've seen what's transpired over the years. And Mr. Morris, I want to first thank you for being so involved and engaged in trying to find out what are the issues. And I think as we move forward, that the new BESE board is going to have to address this in a meaningful way so that it is able to put something in place that people can understand, that people in school systems can work with, and that takes into consideration you have 69 school systems, public school systems, you have the charter schools. The level of resources, human capital, and financial resources is vastly different across this state. And if we're going to expect people to reach the criteria that you set, we're going to have to provide some resources. Some already have resources. Thank goodness for those districts, and a couple of them are represented sitting in this audience today. But we also have some that do not have the human capital, that do not have certified teachers in the classroom, that do not have financial resources. A couple of those are represented here today. I would ask that we continue to be involved in the discussions as superintendents, principals of schools, and accountability personnel from districts, as well as school board members. And I think if we do that, then it might not be totally compatible with what people want, but at least people would feel at least that they have had a voice and their concerns have been considered, and hopefully, maybe not all of them, but some of them would be addressed. So I'm speaking as a former superintendent, not for the Superintendent's Association.
Thank you, Mr. Falk. Please be sure and fill out a card for us.
Morning, Danny Garrett, Executive Council of Louisiana School Boards Association. First of all, I think it's very important to talk about accountability, but I think you have to start with the test itself. We have run sample leap questions through about a half dozen different Lexile programs and found that on average, the 3 to 8 assessments are usually written at about 3 to 4 grade levels above the grade being tested. That seems to me to be absurd. I'm just a lawyer, but it seems absurd. Additionally, if you look at how our current test is assigned, SoStudies test is basically a reading comprehension test. You read source material, you answer questions about it. It doesn't ask kids questions about a social subject topic they were taught in class. I understand that growth is important, and it is important. But when you look at growth, be careful to not lean too far into it. If you have somebody with a score of 100 and they improve by 5 points, that's 5% growth. You have someone started at 50 and they improve by 5 points, that's 10% growth. So are you judging one over the other? Are you going to say that the 100 who went to the 105 didn't achieve half as much? You have to be careful with that. Also, and I think it was raised somewhat by Ms. Davis, over the last 10 years, we have made multiple changes to where the finish line is. We reduced how many points a student gets for mastery and basic. So you could have had exactly the same number of students score mastery from one year to the next, and your score was going to drop. We are in a process where we're getting ready to change the threshold level for an A, B, C, and D. We're going to change it twice over the next 2 years. Now, it was supposed to go a little slower, but then COVID came in, so they postponed it. But the current plan, at least on BESE's website, shows that next year, all of those thresholds go up by 5 points, and the year after that, they go up by 5 points again. And I kind of chuckle because you look at schools, you could have a school that's a 99. If they maintain that 99 over the next 2 years, they're going to drop from an A to a B. And they're going to have done just as well as they did in the prior year, but yet they're going to be scored less. It would seem like if you started a class and the first test you took was on a 10-point scale, and at the end of the term, you said, okay, now I'm going to award grades based on a 6-point scale. Again, those kind of things have to be in the thought process. And I think the bigger issue is, what is accountability for? Is it a gotcha? Is it a, well, we're not doing well, so we need to prove it to people? Or is it supposed to be providing information that educators can use to figure out when a student needs more help somewhere or the other, or whether a curriculum is successful. Because look, as school districts, you go purchase a curriculum, sometimes it's just not as good. It was sold to us. And you have to adapt. And we've had experience with districts who used a curriculum for 2 or 3 years, saw their scores drop, so they reverted to a different curriculum. And it's a choice that they regret, but it happens. The term gaming has been used several times, and I consider that to be a pejorative. The fact is, BESE decides what is the priority. When BESE decided to make the ACT 25% of a high school score, what did that tell every school district and every high school in the state of Louisiana? Get your ACT score up. You put resources into that. And what happened? Last year, we had a whole discussion in this room about how high school scores were overinflated because we had gamed the system. And then there was a proposal to change accountability, not because they didn't feel like the accountability system that they developed was a good system, but because they wanted to reduce the number of high school A's to align with the number of elementary and middle school A's. So should an accountability system be designed to give us information, or should we decide what we want the number to be at the end and then reverse engineer it? I think the latter is not the way to do it. When you look at this, and again, as Davis brought it up, Dr. Davis brought it up, we are a relatively poor state. We established an MFP in our Constitution, acknowledging that there are some parishes in the state. It doesn't matter how high you make the millage in Tensall Parish. The property is worth so little, and so little of it is even subject to school property taxes that you're not going to generate a lot of money. So we created this equity scale. Problem is, we have changed the MFP per pupil twice in the last 15 years. Twice. 0 in the entire 2019-2023 term of BESE, the legislature, and the governor. Not $1 increase in the MFP. So what has happened is that the poor districts don't have the ability to tax their way and make up the difference. The wealthier districts do, to a great extent. So again, we have to take all that into account. I would hope that what comes out of this group is that we should decide that the accountability system needs to provide us information for areas where we can make improvement and be less about delineating you're good, you're bad, and certainly not figuring out how many good we want to have. Look, life's not a bell curve. I know everybody loves the perfect bell curve. Life's not a perfect bell curve. And I've never liked the bell curve. I taught a class at LSU a few years ago. I wished all of my students would have gotten 100 on every test I gave. It did not, it was terrible the day I had to sit that young lady down and say, you need to drop this class because there's no way you can get to an A. It's not a bell curve. And hopefully we're not looking at it as statisticians. We try to look at it more in the line of educators and how do we make children's lives better. Thank you.
Appreciate your comments. Thank you.
Good morning, Tommy Byler, Superintendent of Vermilion Parish Schools. I'll be very brief. I just want to kind of from taking notes from listening from the conversation this morning. I do appreciate the comment from one of the panelists that what exactly is the accountability system? Is it a check on our system? Is it an ongoing, we're supposed to use this information to grow at a daily basis? And so I think it comes down to, Mr. Morris, the many meetings I've said here, what is college and career readiness? What is our accountability system for? So please don't lose sight of that as we move forward. I also want to just want to appreciate and support, and I want to make sure that, Dr. Davis, you made a comment about, and I appreciate it, as a sitting superintendent, we need to make sure that we realize we're already chasing a moving target. And as a high achieving school system, we've done well. We're chasing a moving target. And when you start changing, we're chasing a moving target and we start changing the pieces that belong to that moving target, you're putting school systems at a disadvantage. And so I would just hope that we take that big picture. And I know you guys will. I appreciate the conversation, but I don't want to lose sight of that. Where are we going with that moving system and the moving parts that go with the system? And finally, I just want, I had an opportunity with Mr. Chris, the future of LEAP assessment 2025. We spent about a year and a half ago, we spent 5 different sessions sitting in this same building talking about how our test doesn't really match our growth model. And so as we move to change to a growth model, whichever model we use, we also know that our LEAP 2025 contracts are going to come up. And that's the reason we gave that. So can we get those models to match? Because we sat there for 5 sessions and said, our test doesn't necessarily match the system that we've ended up with. I mean, our growth system has changed and that model changed. The test was purchased way before any of you guys were here, way before we were superintendents. The model changed, but the test was already there. And so as we do that, I just don't want us to lose sight that we're also in a process. We talked about through-year testing. Don't think that's a possibility. But I think it goes back to that original question. What's the purpose of our accountability system? And so I just appreciate the comments and I appreciate the opportunity to listen. And as a sitting superintendent, I will continue to stay involved with this.
Appreciate your comments. Thanks for coming out today.
Mr. Morris, I'm sorry, if you don't mind. I wanted to ask Mr. Mike a question and he left. So I was waiting until everybody. I don't want anybody to accept some questions. Look, you see he's leaving too. I don't know where Mike went. Oh, he did? Okay, he went. I'll just wait.
All right. Looks like there's a search out for Mr. Falk. We'll certainly follow up on that. Ms. Holloway, Dr. Pope.
Hi, good morning. Janet Pope, Louisiana School Board Association Executive Director. Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak today. I know Danny had a couple of comments and I wanted to add some as well. First of all, I want to say we have been watching these meetings online and it is so refreshing to absolutely see specialists, people who understand statistics, assessments, growth models, VAM, coming to the table and helping and assisting us in Louisiana. So for those of you who are online and in the room, thank you so much. I'd like to make a comment about Mr. Lambert's comment, just to kind of put some context out there as to some of the other challenges that we do have in Louisiana and have raised many times. Mr. Lambert blamed school districts for spending too much time cleaning up their assessment data as to the reasons why scores are released so late. He also said the initial data was used, most scores would go down. So in other words, my question is, does the state make mistakes? I think that every state does have a cleanup time where they can clean up their data. Our biggest concern in this state lately has been getting zeros for students that we've lost due to hurricanes, tornadoes, other weather, things that have happened the past couple of years. Also to our homeschool students. Our school systems, when we lose students to homeschool accredited schools or non-accredited schools, we are getting zeros in the accountability system as well. So just wanted to raise that, especially as we just had a news article about diploma mills here in Louisiana. So just wanted to call that to your attention. Also to thanks again for helping and assisting us in Louisiana. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Pope. Mr. Falk, I believe you've been summoned to the table.
May I make a comment before he?
I'm sorry. Mr. Castile, you had a question for Dr. Pope.
No, not a question, Dr. Pope, who's my good friend, but in her comments, she referenced Mr. Lambert sort of blaming schools, and I think he was saying that this was maybe a reason as opposed to blame. So just sort of to call that out, that I think what Mr. Lambert was attempting to say is that here's a reason for we may need to make some adjustments, but just so that we would understand the rationale behind the delay. So in defense of Mr. Lambert, I just want to bring that out, and I do appreciate where you're coming from, but I think he was trying to help us with our understanding.
we strive to work very closely with the Department of Education and Accountability to make sure that our scores are accurate. And this isn't the first time this comment has come up in accountability meetings. As you know, just thought that those that are online would get a point of clarification.
Great. Thank you. I
Thank you,
appreciate the
Mr. Castillo.
extra comment.
Janet's like the mama. She's taking care
Yes.
of her people.
I've been doing this a long time. I'm like Mr. Falk. He may have a little more gray hair than me.
You have more hair. Definitely.
But again, been around over 30 years, just like Mr. Falk back in the day. You know, we always like to give kudos to our pioneers and Cecil Picard and starting accountability here in Louisiana. And we're all about accountability. But we want to make sure that not only is it equitable, is it transparent, but we also want to make sure that it's fair. And I'll just throw this in for those who are online. What we say is if other states are doing this, great, then let's replicate it and stop trying to reinvent the wheel.
Thank you, Dr. Pope.
Thank you, Dr. Pope.
Just, and Mr. Castillo, appreciate that effort at collaboration. Thank you.
Yep.
Ms. Holloway, I believe you have the floor.
Yeah, Janet, thank you. And just to piggyback on you, we have a lot of cleanup to do. We have a lot of revamping to do with the system to move us forward to greater things, greater outcomes. Appreciate your work. Appreciate, you being here and making these comments. And surely there should be something greater coming. And appreciate the panel that's here, as you said. So thank you.
We look forward to working with the next BESE and continuing to work with the Department of Education. We always say we want what's best for kids.
Absolutely.
All kids. And I think that every meeting that we have dealing with accountability and things that are tied to that is, that's what we want, all of us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I have a Mr. Mike. It's just a point of clarification about, you made a comment about the resources. We all know that the schools struggle with resources. And I'm not quite sure if we're on the same path in your conversation, because as we spoke about more clarity, actionability, et cetera, from the results, am I understanding that you may have heard, because I think I may have heard this in the conversation about the results and what information can we deliver to our schools in regards to the results? And is it, I'm taking it as, are we saying, here's a list and these are those things that we want to see delivered because you may have scored this? And here you come and you say, well, we don't have the resources. Just be aware and delivering this in a meaningful way. Are you taking it as, are you concerned that this board may set priorities of, if you're in A school or if you're B school or C school, these are those things that you should be doing, or you should have some type of action taken, like intervention, or you should hire a coach, or you should have these particular things? I just want to understand.
I mentioned in my discussion, not only human capital, the people on staff, the people that you have working in the system, number one. Number two, the people in the classrooms. You have uncertified teachers. And research indicates that a qualified, highly effective teacher can make a difference in the performance of students in that classroom. But you have districts that have a large number of uncertified staff, day to day. That's human resource. Financial resources. ESSER funds are going to run out. And the ability of some districts of what they are able to provide for the students and the teachers in the classroom are no longer going to be available. So if you bring forth, these are the things here, these are the weak areas, these are the areas you need to work on, and they don't have the capability to direct the resources to it, then they have a list, but they're not going to be able. It's like fighting a raging tiger with a wet
mandates,
noodle.
right?
Okay,
Yeah.
Fighting a raging tiger with a wet noodle.
Got it. Okay. Thank you. And Mr. Danny, thank you for all your talking points. One that really interests me, even before as we spoke, was the threshold about the different changes that occur every so many years. And when year leap, what is it, leap 2025, and the school should be here, and it's has always been confusing to me. You thought so? Thank you.
COVID actually made it more confusing because we were on a schedule to gradually increase the threshold. So to get an A, went from a 90 to a 95. A lot of people thought that was actually happening this year, but we confirmed it's not. It was supposed to happen a year or two ago. Then with COVID and kind of all what happened, it got delayed. What was originally designed, it was supposed to go from 90 to 95 maybe a year or two ago, and then, or I guess 25, it was then supposed to go for A from 95 to 100. Well, because of COVID, that first change got delayed, and the current document that I saw on BESE on the LDOE website shows that this next school term, next November, A will go from 90 to 95. You have to have a 95 to have an A. Then the year after that will go to 100. It just seems like a huge dramatic jump. I mean, you could have a school district that's currently a 92, and which is an A, but to hold on to their A 2 years from now, they'll have to experience 8 points of growth, which is pretty significant growth year over year. And so I think it's something that we have to take a look at. Again, when the changes were made to mastery and basic, used to be basic was 100, mastery was 125. One of the things we did do in working with the legislature is passed a bill that said, look, let's issue 2 scores in that first year of the new scoring paradigm so that we can have that comparability, because otherwise you would have been comparing someone's score from year 2 to year 1, but in year 2 they only got 100 points for mastery. In year 1 they had gotten 125 points for mastery, and that's what gets very confusing, I think, for the public, because it looks like their school got worse. They actually didn't. We just decided to change. Look, I know if you have students that are on a 10-point scale and you go to them and say, we're going to go to the old 6-point scale now, that kid with a 93 gets really upset because they used to have an A. When I taught at LSU, I had the good fortune, I guess, to be the first semester that LSU went to the plus-minus grading scale. So I was required to set up plus-minus. And I had a student come to me and before the final, and she was beside herself because she had a 4.0. She was in her senior year. It was a 4,000 level poli-sci course. And if she made an A- in my class, she was not going to graduate with a 4.0 because she was only going to get 3.7 quality points instead of the 4. It was, frankly, it was very sad that she was stressed about that. So she was going to make an A in my class. The question was she going to make a high enough A to get all 4 quality points?
Right.
I think you have to take that into account, because when you change those numbers and then you look back to decide if what the school's trajectory is, you can't really do that.
Yeah,
so
it's
I think
confusing.
that you have to be cognizant of that when y'all set up the system, whenever you make changes.
Thank you. And I have one more. Thank you, Mr. Danny. Appreciate it. One more comment. Tommy, thank you. Hopefully, Tommy Vermillion. There you are. I thought you were sitting in. Thank you for being here and appreciate, and hopefully we can look at that LEAP exam. Absolutely.
Hi, I'm going to be real quick. I know everybody's ready for a break. I'm Kelly LaBove. I'm the accountability supervisor of Livingston Parish. So I'm over 44 sites with 27,000 students approximately. In response to the data cleanup, it does take us a little time to do data cleanup, but we received those reports on August 31st. Our due date to turn those in was September 22nd. The final end date got pushed back to October 6th. So just to give some perspective on where we are with cleanup. However, to address the confusion, I think the confusion is already there. And my reason for that is the department releases scores. Y'all release scores on August 1st for LEAP, Mastery, and above. Those came out. Those are pre-cleanup. Those went out to the public. Everyone's judged on that. Our schools look at that. We take that and we soak it in and we learn and we grow. So we're already releasing scores. It's very confusing for 44 sites with some have up to 4 administrators, data contacts, and we're trying to explain to the schools, the students, the teachers, the parents. We have pre-cleanup data. That's the mastery and above. And then we have our post-cleanup data. That's what was released in November. So there's a large gap between August and November, and the confusion is there. And then when we get these scores in November, it's so hard as an educator to stop and go back to last year when you've spent a half a year with these students, these new students. So now I really have to go back and think of each individual kid. How did this kid grow? Did they make their target? Let me remember what was going on with this kid, because that was 150 kids ago that I had last year. That's not my 150 this year. It is a massive shift in thinking for educators. It would be so much more impactful, like Dr. Brophy said, to get those scores in hand, even if they're pre-cleanup, because the confusion's there. So if we could get them, that would be amazing.
Thank you. Really appreciate that. I think there's been a lot of comments today on the timeliness issue, and I'm sure we're going to capture those comments and double underline them. So thank you for that. All right. Any other comments from our board members? All right. Hearing none, we're adjourned. I think we're going to come back in, how much time do we need, board members? 5 minutes? 5 minutes? We'll return in 5 minutes. Thank you.
Okay.
Well, thank you. Thank you for your work. It was under your so it's Jada Minnesota hired and very yeah. That's when everybody had to wait for the job and they were so we did that and then we have the meetings where we were together. CPS is those who we would like to stay out and do their safe training. And that was those holidays were reading it down the page long. Remember that was okay, yeah, and we would have like exactly. And then they would put it in the the room, and I was always focused on the teacher effectiveness things or the. So yeah, the critical thinking, that's where we want to.
We almost start right there. Yeah. We're good to reach that.
Yeah. I do. I love that thing.
Yeah, so we got an hour. Hey, there she is. Hour and a half plus lunch. Hey, yeah, thanks so much. We can't even have.
Oh, wow.
Right.
to see if we couldn't gather everyone again to get started up. We don't want to hold our distinguished panel up. I know they've got a hard schedule as well. So thank you.
They ran out. Yeah.
All right, if we could, let's return to our agenda. We've got the second item here. Consideration of discussion regarding growth model feedback and next steps. Can I get a motion? Ms. Holloway, and a second, Mr. Castile. Thank you. Chris, I believe you have the floor.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Morris. And I see we have Christine here in the room now. So it's a delight to have you here. And I'm going to share screen to pull the some slides back up. And if I may, panel members of the board, what I'd like to propose is let me walk through a set of slides where we've attempted to take a look at some of the prominent models that we've talked about against these priorities. I'll try to limit that to 10 to 15 minutes. So I'll go through it very succinctly. You know, the panelists have the slides so they can linger on them longer as needed during our discussion. And I believe the participants in the room have paper copies of those. And then we'll open this up for broad comment. I think by way of time, it's 10 minutes after 11 now. I think we want to make sure we wrap up by about 11:45, 11:50, Mr. Chair, for another opportunity for public comment, as I understand the remaining time that we have today. So in light of the priorities that we've identified, and we know that they're going to be improved based on the excellent conversation we had in the first session of the meeting this morning, we do want to take a look at how these approaches stack up. This is not easy to do. It's not easy to come up with a really crisp rating, for example, for each one. So we try to do our best to provide some notes and feedback about the strengths and limitations of the various approaches against these priorities, as Mr. Morris has encouraged us to do, which we think is a strong approach. And then we'll also talk about implementation issues and challenges, some of which we picked up in the first session this morning, but maybe we can punctuate a little more sharply in the second part of our time today. So the approaches that we're going to talk about, you see listed here, value table, growth percentiles, value added approaches, gain score, and growth to standard. As I said, when we first talked about these models, every list of models is limited. They're not all perfectly mutually exclusive. So they overlap a little bit, but we use this as an organizing structure, which I hope the panel and the board members will find helpful. So the value table, we talked about this at some length, that we gave examples from Mississippi, and we acknowledged Florida uses value tables. There's probably another half a dozen or more states that use value tables as well. And we've listed the priorities there on the left. Again, they're going to be revised. And we're reflecting on how well does it address those priorities or answer those questions. And I don't think I'll read every cell on every table for you, but maybe I'll try to pick up some of the high points as we go to help stimulate conversation here in this next portion of the meeting. Value tables, like many approaches, can incorporate both norm and criterion referenced elements, but they have to be intentionally designed for that purpose. Now, I will say a value table is bakes in growth to standard. Mr. Lambert mentioned that earlier, that there's a very explicit definition in the way value tables are structured that represent growth to standard, progression from like a lower part of a performance level to a upper part, or from level to level. That's an example of a growth to standard progression. But you can add additional mechanisms to enable norm referencing of value tables. It's a little more coarse, which is something else that we note here as we provide reflections on the value table. And you see that there in the fourth priority. By way of course, I mean, you might have small degrees of improvement or decline. If they don't cross a performance category threshold, then they won't be picked up. And you could say, well, we can design value tables in order to be more sensitive. And you would be right with a claim like that. But taken to an extreme, if you do those kinds of things, then you work against what many people regard as a very positive aspect of value tables, which is that they're straightforward to understand and to implement. So for example, instead of dividing up the assessment into 8 or 10 categories, you could say, oh, let's divide it up into 100 categories. If you do something like that, you're actually starting to create a little bit of like a growth percentile method, depending on how you divide it up. But so you can see you'd work against simplicity. If you did that, you'd work against sort of meaningful progression of standards. But the larger point here is that the design really governs how well these priorities are honored. So it's certainly transparent and configurable. It is probably, of all the models we'll talk about, the most straightforward to understand and implement. I think that's something that we talked about when we reviewed some implementation, such as when we looked at the Mississippi model. Thanks to Mr. Lambert and his colleagues, we have some impact data for the value tables. I'll do my best to represent what's on the slide, and Mr. Lambert, if you'll jump in if you feel that I do this incompletely, then please do so.
It might be good to move the panelists on your screen so that folks that are looking at the
Okay, I don't think
PowerPoint.
I'm controlling that, am I?
Oh, it's over here. I'll take
yeah.
care of it.
Okay, so while he's doing that, I'll cover this information because I know time is at a premium here. So what the department team did is they took the current LEAP assessment, divided it into the categories that you see represented in the panel to the left there. So you've got unsatisfactory lower from 650 to 674, higher from 675 to 699, and so forth. Mastery is kept at one level, advanced is kept at one level. And you can see in the notes here, students who were in mastery or advanced were expected to maintain. So they were awarded as meeting their target if they maintained. If they're not yet at proficiency, need to advance a partial level. So from UL to UH or AL to AH. And again, you might say, oh, I would specify it differently if I were, making the call. And that's just exactly the point. There are lots of ways to do that. The department was gracious enough to represent at least one so we could see the impact here per conversation at previous meetings. On the right side, you see the findings. The first panel shows what percentage of students meet their target, and the bottom row is all students. And then they've also distinguished it between students who are economically disadvantaged and those who are not economically disadvantaged. And you can see the results are somewhat more favorable by that metric using a value table compared to the current approach. So, for example, all students, you see 62% and change earning points on a transition or value table compared to 46.9% in the current approach. And then in one final look, and then I'll pass it to Mr. Lambert, see if he wants to add any additional context. If we instead of looking at percentages, look at this on a 150-point scale. I believe that was accomplished by simply looking at what percent meeting target is of 150, and then compare that to the current approach. Then you'll see those numbers are more similar, but still slightly more favorable for the value of transition table approach. Mr. Lambert, any additional context you'd add? Okay. So that's one look. And again, you'll see we've made notes throughout as we've looked at the different models of where additional research or insights could help inform decision-making. But we knew this was one particularly requested analysis. So I'm grateful to the department for providing that. I know I said I'd wait to the end for questions, but given that this is a lot of information, I feel like I should at least pause here to see if the panel has any clarifying questions about the value table impact or anything I've said to this point.
Mr. Lambert, what would you say is our major takeaway from this slide?
I think there are a few takeaways. The first way that we looked at this was that the percent of students earning 100 points or more, so they either met their growth to mastery target or were fairly high on their VAM, was about 46.9% under the traditional system. When you look at the value table, which is the simulation on the left, the table on the left, students are moving a half an achievement level at a rate a little bit higher than that. So the VAM model actually is identifying fewer kids as making substantial progress than a model that divides achievement levels in half, essentially. I think that one is an interesting takeaway. I will say that this past year, we did see a good amount of student improvement in our LEAP results. So that's not completely surprising. But we intentionally did 1 year of data instead of 2, because the last 2 years have been pretty substantial and the prior year was so much more. So we wanted to give a more accurate representation, but these simulations only bear out so long as improvement is as marked as it's been in the last 2 years, if that makes sense.
Right. I'll continue on, and again, I'll stay flexible, members of the panel, if you want to chime in with a question. So growth percentiles is we provided some reflections on the extent to which they correspond with the priorities. Again, this is all in service to stimulating conversation from the panel. Can they incorporate norm and criterion reference information? Yes, they sort of bake in, they do bake in the norm referencing by definition. And as we've mentioned in previous meetings, they can address criterion or growth to standard priority if you do something post hoc, like add an adequate growth percentile or otherwise name a percentile that's required in order to meet the kind of the trajectory that's valued. So you could think of growth percentiles through a model like student growth percentiles or Louisiana's current VAM, removing every covariate with the exception of prior performance. Those would essentially accomplish the same thing. Are they straightforward to understand and implement? Moderate support is our judgment there. We think that clear reporting and training can bolster clarity there. But in contrast to value or transition tables where we said there's strong support, these certainly aren't quite as clear, particularly if people want to lift the hood and look at the statistics behind them. These are certainly, the methodology is much more complicated for a growth percentile or a value added model compared to a value table. There's a strong research base, so I think we can make a claim that they're technically defensible, appropriately precise and comparable, again, in context, assuming the assessment properties are well suited to support growth percentiles. And we've seen evidence that they're generally strong support for differentiating performance, but this is one of the many places where we note that analyses should be run to examine outcomes with respect to Louisiana data. So let's look at estimation error across the scale. Let's look at what the relationship is to prior year status. I would say that of every model, and growth percentiles would be no exception. So our reflection that generally we would expect strong support is based on what we've seen in other states, but always strong when we can look at Louisiana specific data. And are they transparent and configurable? Again, a lot of this is it depends. Growth percentile approaches are available through open access code and are configurable. And so as long as if the department were pursuing this kind of solution and did so through some open source resources, then that would be strong support.
Chris, I know we covered this in previous meetings, but do you recall which states use growth percentiles?
This is the one that's used most frequently. So there's something like 19 states, if memory serves, that use growth percentiles. So straight away, I can tell you Massachusetts, Michigan, Georgia. So there's actually a lot of states that use growth percentiles.
Great. And I know you guys are going to put that in the final document. I just
Yes.
wanted folks that are following today to be able to track that as well.
Absolutely. So the value-added model, Louisiana currently uses a value-added model. Again, value-added models, there's a range of approaches that can represent value-added. We're using the definition for the purposes of this panel and this discussion that a value-added model is a statistical model that has a number of background factors included beyond prior performance or covariates. So some of this is very similar to growth percentiles. How well does it support norm and criterion reference information? There's strong support for this priority if additional mechanisms are added. Again, I made the comment earlier in this meeting that Louisiana does just that. They have growth to standard elements layered on top of a value-added model that itself is more norm referenced without those layers. So that's an example of how those can come together. Is it straightforward to understand and implement? We're going to call this weak to moderate. I realize there's some judgment that's involved here, but these, I think most people would agree that these are among the more complex of models, at least, again, if you're going to look at the methodology under the hood. But like we said, for growth percentiles, supporting understanding and use is best achieved through clear reporting and training. And then just as a personal reflection, I'll note, things that people become used to become more clear over time. So stability contributes to clarity with any model that, so, you know, you can go to something that's a more a straightforward or streamlined model like value add, or excuse me, like a value table. There'll be some initial confusion or complexity with that until that gets established and there's some stability and there's some understanding over time. So I think that's worth acknowledging as well. Very strong support in my judgment that they're technically defensible, precise, comparable. There's a strong research base for both Louisiana's model and other value-added models that are used in the country, like EVOS, that happens to be a commercial product run by SAS. There is evidence that they can adequately differentiate performance. In fact, I would say on the question of the extent that we value a weaker correlation with things like percent of students who are at mastery and advance, these models will probably stack up most favorably because they do take into account those background factors. And so they're probably going to differentiate more prominently than you're going to see from other models. But again, as many of the panelists have noted, all of these priorities have interrelationships. If you go strong on one, you might be weaker on another. Are they transparent and configurable? We think there's strong support if the model is open access, like we said about growth percentiles, and is configurable. Here in Louisiana, it is configurable. It is open to inspection. And we want to bookmark that we would like the panel to talk about advice about background factors in our conversation. And I promise I will stop talking soon so we can open up for these conversations. I'll go a little more quickly. Gain scores. The biggest point I'd want to make here is gain scores would be a real challenge to incorporate in Louisiana because it requires a vertical scale. Gain scores, colleagues, are simply subtraction models. We say, what is it's a mean score for a school in year 2. Let's subtract from that the mean score in year 1. The difference is the gain score, and that's the unit that's used for growth. You need a vertical scale to do that. And even with the vertical scale, my panel colleagues can disagree with me if they'd like. I still think under those approaches that comparability and differentiation is more suspect. I think that there's a high imperative to evaluate that with Louisiana data. And I'll just put a sharper point on it by saying this. The research I've seen shows that with gain score models, if you're looking at students who are very, say, low performing versus those that are high performing, they aren't as comparable as people think they are. It's harder to get to demonstrate gains for higher performing than it is for lower performing students. And I think the research bears that out. So you'd have to put some safeguards there. You'd have to look at the data. Frankly, I think gain scores have some challenges as an accountability growth metric, but this is why we have a panel. I'd invite other perspectives on this.
So I have several questions on this one. I guess the first one is we're all getting more familiar with the success story at Mississippi and the things that Mississippi has done to improve their system and provide better outcomes for their students. And I saw that, or I think I understood earlier that Mississippi, at least currently, uses the value table. So I'm assuming they don't use the vertical approach. So how did they manage the assessment process for that cluster of students that were multiple grades behind. Can somebody talk us through anybody have the experience with that, how Mississippi managed that?
Mississippi does use a value table. By the way, they also have vertical scale, which just turns out to be superfluous to the value table. It doesn't help or hinder it. But they, I think what I would say about Mississippi, and Dr. Hovanec has some perspectives as well. We work together in some ways for some projects in Mississippi. I would say that they've seen a lot of benefit through the way they're supporting data interpretation and use and wrapping that with, a host of school supports like literacy initiatives that have really moved the needle. So it really goes much further beyond the accountability system, although I would never want to mitigate the importance of accountability in their overall initiative. But Christy, since I name checked you, do you want to jump in and offer a perspective there? You've got a lot of insight about Mississippi.
Right. So Mississippi really focuses on grade level and grade level content. And so there are students that are low performing, which is why they have split that lowest performing achievement levels. What we're trying to accomplish with the accountability system is measuring whether students are working towards meeting those grade level standards and expectations. As Chris said, there are a lot of other things that Mississippi does instructionally and with assessments for learning, not with their state assessment of learning, to make sure those kids are getting the help that they need. But for purposes of accountability, measuring below grade level isn't going to help us get the information we need for our accountability system.
So how are they able to measure progress with those students?
I'm not exactly sure what you're asking in your question. On the state assessment, they have their scale, they have their vertical scale, as well as their traditional scale achievement levels. And the way they're measuring it is if those students are at the very bottom of the lowest achievement level, if they're not moving up a grade band to the top of the very bottom achievement level, they're just not being counted for growth. So for the purposes of accountability, we're measuring growth to grade level standards. For instructional purposes, Mississippi does have a lot of formative assessments they use for instructional purposes. That looks at where students are and gives them diagnostic assessments in reading outside of their accountability system to make sure that they're getting the instructional help they need. But for purposes of accountability, if those students are truly 2 and 3 years below grade level, they are not demonstrating growth on the state assessment, because we're looking at, are they moving up grade level content?
So maybe what I'm hearing is that they have another tool that provides better resolution to address that concern. Is that the right interpretation?
They have a system of assessments for instruction. So teachers use those instructionally in the classroom to specifically diagnose where students are having challenges and difficulties. So if a teacher gets back a result that says that the student is in the lowest performance level or the bottom of the lowest performance level, they do additional testing for instructional purposes. So outside of their accountability system, they're also doing a lot of things for instruction and supporting students.
Okay, and then you also made a reference to use of the vertical scale. Can you speak to that a little bit more?
Again, because Mississippi has a vertical scale, as Chris said, it was superfluous because we use the difference in achievement level movement. So the vertical scale underlies everything, but it's not used in the state accountability system to demonstrate growth.
Okay, so it's used in parallel. Is that the right interpretation?
It's used to provide information on student level reports, but it's not used as part of the school accountability system.
Got it. Okay, that's very helpful. Thank you.
Thanks, Christy. I'll be really swift and just wrapping up a few more slides, and I really want to open this up broadly. Growth to standard approach, let me not linger on this. We've talked a little bit about how growth to standard interacts with our priorities for academic progress. It would require additional mechanisms to provide norm referenced information, but depending on the way in which it's specified, you can see here on the slide how it lines up with many of the priorities similar to some other models. I'll just say differentiation of performance would be the area where I'd have the most concern about that. And I think there'd be some real notes about needing to run some analyses to check that with more fidelity. This is the last slide before I pause here. I know Mr. Morris and others invited us to think very clearly about implementation considerations. And so this last table, we show the growth models there on the rows instead of the priorities. Now it's the growth models. And we provide some notes about what those implementation considerations or impact really are. And in most cases, and Mr. Lambert may want to chime in on this because I know he and his team are really on the front lines with this, but we think there's minimal to moderate impact for most of these models with two exceptions, and I'll just name those and then I'll be quiet. One is anything that requires the state to develop a vertical scale. I've already mentioned that, so I'll just emphasize that now, is a major undertaking. It will take time, it will take money, it will take a change in the assessment contract. And any growth solution that's proprietary that would require the state to engage in some kind of procurement will take time, will take money, but the department's very high capacity. They have the ability, and again, Mr. Lambert's the best person to address this, so he'll reel me in if I speak out of school, I hope. They have the capacity to make adjustments to the current model, to help design and configure other approaches like value tables, or similar growth to standard approaches. So you'll see in most cases, minimal to moderate impact is expected for each of these. But Mr. Lambert, I'd invite you to chime in if you feel like that's okay. So with that, thank you. I know that I talked very fast and went through a lot of information. I'm going to wait to do next steps at the end. But members of the panel, members of the board, let's open it up for your comments.
Solway, good. Mr. Castillo? Good. Dr. Bofi has stepped out. Okay. I believe the members are good. I see Christy's got her hand raised.
Yeah, please go ahead, Christy.
Thank you, Chris. This was a very easy to digest summary of the models. One of the things that I am really challenged with in accountability systems are particularly the growth percentiles and the value-added models for a few reasons. First is that schools don't know what amount of growth students have to make until after the school year is over in order to be credited with growth. That growth expectation under these two models changes every year, depending on how students performed in the previous year. It's a zero-sum game, so there will be those that make growth guaranteed, and there will be those that don't make growth guaranteed. These models inherently set different expectations for different students by conditioning on the prior scores and not expecting the same amount of improvement, just moving over achievement levels. And because we have different expectations each year, the percent of students making growth is not longitudinally comparable. So, and there are no opportunities for states or districts to be able to replicate these models because they use state level student data. And so districts and schools aren't able to redo or calculate or use these models on their own. So those are some of the challenges I have with this, particularly in for uses in accountability systems. And I know they do have their merits, and I'm sure we'll hear from other panelists about that, but I am concerned that we don't have the same expectations for all kids of moving up a half achievement level and having changing and differing expectations over the years.
Chris, did you call on me? I couldn't.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't have my mic on. Pardon me. I'll say that again.
Okay, I wasn't sure if it was you or me.
Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah. I mean, just a couple of thoughts. I mean, Chrissy, I appreciate that concern. I do think there are options within a student growth percentile approach, particularly using a baseline approach that resolves some of those concerns. Not all of them, but some of them. So, I think there is a little bit of flexibility in there. Chris, you had on the side of the value added, using background variables. I've raised this before. That concerns me a little bit because inherently you are then explicitly establishing different expectations for different groups of kids based on background. And to me, I mean, I can understand why that might be attractive to a school that serves very different schools serving different groups of kids. But when you think about it from the student perspective, that's I have a hard time with that. The other comment I want to share is the growth to standard. I know we talked a little bit about whether the value or the priority of the growth indicator providing information that's not redundant with achievement, just straight out achievement scores or categorizations. And it seems to me that growth to standard has potential to be much more redundant.
Yeah.
Only because for kids that are further away, they have much larger growth expectations that quickly become unrealistic, particularly in outgoing years. And so effectively their achievement score level is almost making it impossible for them to obtain those growth expectations. So I think that's a little bit of a, I don't know if it's a concern, but something to think more carefully about. So those are just my initial three reactions.
Thanks for those comments. I want to say back a few of them because I think it's really important. On the growth to standard piece, and I really think of growth to standard as more of a feature or a design element of models than its own standalone model. I think if you do it as an own standalone model, I think it presents some challenges that you articulated very nicely. I agree. I'd love to hear other panelists talk about the challenges of the background characteristics. Again, I know I'm being subjective when I say this. So this is connected to policy and values. It's not solely a technical statement, but I think Louisiana has a lot of background factors that are considered. So I think examining that list would be in their interest. And I think Mike points out some of the cautions about using them at all or using such a robust list that is used in Louisiana. We could talk about that more as needed. And I just kind of want to go on record. Christy knows how much I value and hold her up as a esteemed colleague, and she's really good. But we disagree on growth percentiles and some of the caveats that she mentioned. Mike talked about one. He talked about baselining. That's a way to sort of counteract that zero-sum game piece that she was worried about. I also think that's just an empirical question. People react to that in the same way that they do value-added models, because there's this hypothesis that a magnitude of growth that's not regarded as favorable in one year will be really terrific in a subsequent year, and the model won't pick up on that. That's something that analyses can check for and address. And there's, of course, also additional elements like adequate growth percentiles and the like that can help give a criterion referenced. But I don't want to overdo this, but I just wanted to put other perspectives on the table as well.
Members, other thoughts, comments before we go to public comment? I just want to add one. I know that whenever, Chris, when you guys present to the board in December, but particularly for the benefit of the next BESE, if you guys could provide us an example for a typical, I don't want to say typical, if you guys could provide us an example for at least student that's in that cluster that we've been referring to that have not achieved mastery yet. If you guys could provide us an example for each one of these models for how applying that model to a student in that cluster, how that would play out relative to what we're using today. I think that would be very helpful for the next board when they consider the different options.
If it pleases the chair, can I ask if the other panelists have comments? And then I would just reflect on some next steps and then public comment. Is that okay, Mr. Chair?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Greg, did you have any reflections that you wanted to offer?
Well, I guess two, since I'm invited. I think I'll second Chris's respect for Christy and so forth. But I do think the attributes of student growth percentiles can be configured in such a way as to avoid some of the concerns that Christy has. I'm not pushing for that, but I do see some of those things she mentioned as not particular limitations. One thing that I thought should maybe be considered, Chris, in your slides you had phrasing along these lines that for this particular model, you'd have to do some work to incorporate some norm referenced information. For this other model, you'd have to do some work to incorporate some criterion referenced information. My sense is that it's probably easier, because cost and feasibility are factors, right? Easier to incorporate the norm reference than it would be to incorporate criterion referenced information in any particular model. I think the level of work and analysis and getting a fine-grained information about what students are actually knowing and can do to report criterion reference information is trickier than just doing the data analysis required to show normatively where people are.
Thank you, Greg. Christine, did you want to offer any reflections?
Sure. Is my mic on?
Yeah, you want to look for the green button. Is the green light on?
Yes,
There
it
you go.
is.
You're
Okay,
good.
wonderful.
Maybe pull a little closer to you.
Thank you.
There you go.
Okay. I want to thank you for making such clear summaries of the different varieties of growth metrics that are available to folks. I think this will be very helpful to the public in being able to provide authentic and meaningful feedback based on all the work that you put in to, gauge what some of the options and considerations are. So that is certainly much appreciated. Simply because it was an item for discussion, I would say with regard to VAM, for educators, there is a value in understanding whether and how different instructional approaches are valuable and reflecting on that, especially as it pertains to groups of students who are underserved or who are members of gap groups. However, I don't know that trying to adjust for each of those covariates in a VAM system is great for reflecting and looking at accountability overall. It might provide useful information in a different capacity, but I think for the purposes of trying to incorporate a measure that the public can understand in an accountability system, you did an amazing job outlining some options that are much more helpful and digestible for the public and various partners, investors, and stakeholders in the education system. So thank you.
Sorry, Dr. Bophy.
I understand that we're going to be hearing from the panelists. As we do, I am curious in terms of their belief of which one of these best measure growth.
Relative to Louisiana student population?
I mean, I'm interested in their individual. Like, I know we got a broad overview.
What's their personal preference?
Yes,
Okay.
for growth.
Okay, Chris, can you tackle that one?
I am probably going to frustrate you. I honestly, I'm going to go back to my remarks. I just don't think there's a gold standard approach. I think that Louisiana can continue with the current value-added model with some adjustments and honor many of the priorities that we've talked about. I also think that if you want to privilege something that's more straightforward or something that has more design elements with respect to growth to standard, there are some attractive options through value tables that I think, but again, they really do interact with what the policy values are and what the priorities are, which is why I'm so glad that that was such a prominent part of our conversation here. I honestly don't have a Chris Domaleski favorite, and I don't think there's a single one that really shines as this is the North Star for growth. And if more states would do it like this, we'd see better outcomes for students. I think there's a lot of approaches that are very promising that can be used in very effective ways when supported by the right kinds of ancillary activities and initiatives to improve outcomes for students. I really don't want to sound like a bureaucrat, but that's really
I'm gonna ask you a follow-up question that'll help humanize you. Funny coming from me.
Yeah.
So in what ways should student characteristics, where students are performing, inform which model is chosen? Or do you think that it does not have a big impact on choosing which model, that you have a lot of students in the lower achievement levels and fewer in the upper achievement levels?
So I think that becomes a design priority. And what I would recommend, and we've done this in other states, is I would look for an adequate degree of sensitivity for growth across the full spectrum. And I think you can empirically compare models to that. You can compare value tables and growth percentiles and other approaches. And again, I don't think if we prioritize that to the exclusion of everything else, then we might be left with a model we don't like that has other problems. But I would add that as one criterion among others in my investigation. And I should probably qualify it. I'm speaking too much. I'd love the other panel to weigh in on this. But while I don't think there's a single right way to do it, I do think there are some wrong ways to do it. And I'll put my thumb on the scale a little bit that I have a high degree of skepticism about gain score models, because I just don't think they're comparable in ways they need to be for accountability purposes. But
And I think Dr. Bofi love to hear from our distinguished panelists as well.
Christy, you have your hand up.
Yes, I will put my hand on a scale with this one. When I'm looking at these models, I'm looking at it from the perspective of what do we want students to be able to do? And we want students to master grade level content. So I want a model that measures growth towards the mastery of those grade level content standards. And I know if we use a value table approach, something that's like what we use in Florida and what we implemented in Mississippi, that if students are making growth and schools are getting credit for students making that growth, if they continue to make that growth, they will reach proficiency or mastery on grade level standards. So I am very directive towards having the same expectation for all students. And that expectation is moving an achievement level or half of an achievement level to achieve that mastery of standards. I do not think we should be conditioning based on student background characteristics in any model that we choose, because even those kids that come from disadvantaged or mobile backgrounds, those are the students that we need most to help to reach and achieve grade level standards. So I do generally favor models that are criterion based, particularly value table type models. I want educators to be fully aware of what the expectation is to earn growth for each student, so their school gets credit for it at the beginning of the year. I want those expectations to be the same year after year. And I want to make sure that if a student is meeting those expectations for growth, they will eventually become a proficient student.
Thank you, Christy. Other panelists, would you like to weigh in?
Well, I'll just probably repeat a lot of what Christy just said. Although I'll note, Chris, you said you're going to put your finger on the scale, and Christy put her whole hand on the scale. Yeah, I think we should be cautious there. But I think I'd reassure Louisiana that all of the things that Chris has reviewed have been tried. All have been used, I think, successfully. All have been researched. And whatever approach, we sort of stand on the shoulders of at least people who have done the hard work, and we know what not to do. So as Chris said, there are things you might avoid. I want to go back to support something Christy said about conditioning. I think that's a big problem. That's probably the biggest problem technically, educationally, as well as in sort of the extent to which some stakeholders would embrace this, right? I mean, a lot of folks would say, you know, we really ought to condition because, you know, kids are different and some kids are more mobile. Shouldn't you take that into account? You know, blah, blah, blah. But I really do think that sets different expectations for kids. And that's just not a policy. I'm not the policymaker here, but that's a policy decision I think would be problematic. That said, you know, I think student growth percentiles can work very well. I think value tables can work very well. I think, you know, there's configurability in each of these. The model that Chris showed had like I think it was unsatisfactory low, unsatisfactory high. Each level is broken into 2 levels. There's nothing that says you have to break each into 2 levels. You could break each into 3. There's nothing that says you have to break each into the same number of levels. You could break one level into 2 and another into 3. You know, there's a lot of configurability there, and I think an advantage of that approach is that it's highly accessible to people. You really have a strong sense of what the model is doing, even if you're not technically inclined. So those are my summary comments. Other than to say, very nice summary on your part, Chris. Thank you.
So I heard, I believe, value tables, and was the other one growth percentiles?
Yeah, I probably should have singled out without going back and reviewing the full list. But I've seen student growth percentiles work well, and I think I've seen value tables, sort of growth toward a standard approach, work very well. And they've all been tried and researched in ways that I think have been fairly transparent, and that any of them can work, provided you sort of do your due diligence to avoid the pitfalls that other people have had experience with as they've newly implemented and deployed them.
Mike or Christine, do you want to offer some quick reflections before I very quickly give us some next steps and we turn it back to Mr. Morris?
Yeah, real quickly. I mean, if you could develop a vertical scale that was actually a vertical scale, you know, gain scores, I think, are attractive. I just think for educational constructs that cut across curricular expectations, grade level expectations, that there's not a single construct, and therefore you can't create that scale. So the gain score doesn't work for me. Second thought I'd offer is I believe strongly in rectificatory practices, and what that means is doing more for those who've been the most harmed in the past. And the value table, in my mind, allows you to put that kind of value and that priority and preferences into play to motivate behaviors that are rectificatory. So I'm not saying the value table is the best solution, but in terms of motivating behavior in a way that's clear, I think it has, as its name says, value.
Yeah. Yeah. The value baked right in the name. That's a good point.
I'll just chime in by saying that unfortunately I would decline to voice a preference as well. And harken back to something that I said in one of the earlier meetings, which is that it depends what the goal and use of the growth indicator is as to what the most efficacious approach is. So I do think that for consumers of the information, clarity is important. Contextualization is really important. Preventing and making sure that adequate information is provided to kind of dissuade people from making comparisons that are perhaps unrelated or unwise, or not grounded to year-on-year sort of views is really, really important. So it almost, I don't want to say it doesn't matter which one is chosen, because certainly I think it does. It will result in vastly different categorizations of schools. But what's more important is that after we identify
where growth is being made the most and where we can try to intervene to catch up, that information is used to really equip and empower schools and educators to intervene on behalf of students that need the most help, and it is not used to punish. But I would also voice that I think based on the information we've been provided here, certainly the value table does stick out as something that the public, I think, would really benefit from being able to see.
I'll just quickly acknowledge what I understand to be next steps and then turn it back to Mr. Morris and the board. We, the Center for Assessment, my colleague Chris Brandt and I, are working on a report to encapsulate the process and the recommendations. This meeting has been incredibly valuable, as have the three prior, to do that. We understand there's a lot of ambitions for the report. We're going to do our level best to represent them as fully as possible. Fellow panel members, I want to be clear about how we're seeing you named or acknowledged in the report, which is that we definitely see it as a document produced by the Center for Assessment under contract with the Louisiana Department of Education, the Board of Elementary and Secondary Education, but that we will acknowledge the advice and contributions and tremendous the benefits we had from your interaction. But I'm going to kind of take the pressure off a little bit. We're not seeing it as a co-authored report from the advisors. So what we'll do is we'll have a draft out. Our current plan is to have that on December 8th. We will make sure you have access to that draft so that you can review it. And then that will be presented to the board at their December meeting, which I don't think is the date has been finalized just yet. Okay. Okay, Mr. Morris.
Okay, great. Yeah, I just had one other comment, give other members an opportunity as well. But going back again to page 6 and the 6 bullets there, I want to make sure that we follow up on that, on those 6. And then also, I'm wondering out loud if we should be adding another one, and it's a value question, but it may even be the elephant in the room. But question for me is, should we have the same expectation for all students? I've heard that voiced a lot over all 4 meetings. I think it's critical for the conversation. And I think it's a value judgment that the next BESE is going to have to make. So I'd like to continue that conversation, and the best way to do that would make sure that we capture it in the report.
Yes, sir.
All right.
Yes, sir.
Other members, any comments before we go to public comment? All right. Hearing none, let's open it up for public comment. Do we have any? I think I saw one card. Ms. Harris?
Hi. Good morning. Is it on? Yeah.
You should see the green light. Please look for the green light and then identify yourself for the record, please, ma'am.
Hello, Suzanne Harris from Louisiana Association of Educators. And good morning. I want to give a thanks to BESE for the efforts you're making to learn about the complexity of accountability before making recommendments for change. Assessments in the best case scenario provide educators in the classroom with information that they need to make a difference with student learning. Formative assessments and summative assessments, in addition to performance tasks in the classroom, teacher observation, and other forms of observation, take place all year long and are the most actionable information for educators. The accountability reports provide data that is helpful to identify places where learning gaps exist and that more resources may be needed to be allocated to certain sites. For the individual educator in the classroom, the accountability report provides one data point that can provide context within the scope of ongoing support for students, but it doesn't provide information that's useful on a day-to-day for curricular decisions. Big picture, that's probably not the purpose of the accountability report. Growth and accountability measures can't and shouldn't necessarily drive day-to-day instructional decisions. But educators in the classroom are there, present, and able to help provide a positive learning environment that will help all their students to grow on a daily basis using the information that they have. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, that's all of our public comment as we understand it. Yes, it is. All right. So I'd like to take this opportunity to thank our panelists. You guys bring credibility to this process. So we appreciate your time very much. So look forward to the report out at December BESE. Chris, thank you for your leadership on this. And again, look forward to that report. I want to thank all our BESE members for taking time out to make sure we meet quorum and we can implement this exercise. So thanks to you guys. Thanks for everyone in attendance today too. Thanks for taking time out of your day to come and share your thoughts. So thank you for that. If there's no exception, we'll adjourn our meeting. Thank you. SAC team tomorrow, is that right?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. I apologize. We can't- we think that's better.
Oh, that's okay.